in a relatively unprecedented set of circumstances, the leaks of JJK's newest chapter have come out 10 days before its release. Now, I have absolutely no idea how this could possibly happen, because not only have the leaks been out for about 24 hours, but they've already been uploaded and translated into English. And I'm not just talking about rough translations, I'm talking about the good translations. The translations that make sense, where they scribble out what they say in Japanese in the text bubbles and fill it in with English. That real, high quality stuff. But as of the recording of this video, the new chapter doesn't come out for 9 days, because Gekekatami, after the release of last week's chapter 246, said that there would be a 2-week break. That is to say that there would be 1 week without JJK. And yet, as if there was no 2-week break, we're getting leaks as to when we would usually get leaks, which makes me believe that for some reason there wasn't a 2-week break, which I can really only boil down to the possible fact that Christmas isn't as big in Japan as it is here, and therefore, because American studios are shut down for Christmas and the New Year's, we're experiencing a 2-week break, but Japan isn't. But then America and everywhere that celebrated Christmas would be a chapter behind forever. So how did we get chapter 247 10 days before its supposed releasal? I don't know, but we have it, and that's what matters. And it double matters because this chapter was insane. We got the continuation of the battle between Higuruma, Sukuna, and Yuji, and while all of us that read the Gojo versus Sukuna fight assumed that this battle would at least be a couple of chapters, it's starting to look like this battle is going to be a lot shorter than we anticipated, and for a good reason. See, this chapter did a ton of things, and very quickly. It showed us the true level of Higuruma's genius as a jujitsu sorcerer, and just how incredibly high his ceiling could possibly be. I mean, we're talking Gojo high, and those are Sukuna's words. We got a possible confirmation that the Executioner's sword is going to get more powerful next chapter, and probably more importantly than anything, at least to me, the confirmation of my theory that Yuji has the Kamo curse technique, blood manipulation. Yes, that's right, ladies and gentlemen, we have an absolutely stacked chapter to talk about. So with no further ado, let's jump right on into chapter 247 of JJK, also known as the decisive battle in the uninhabited, demon-infested Shinjuku. So strap in, everyone, because this is a heavy one. But before we get to talking about big and heavy chapters, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. And if you like the idea of me talking about big and heavy things, guys, you're gonna love my anime podcast, Otaku's Anonymous, because me and Danny Mata spend about 20% of the time talking about boobs. It's available on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Or if you just want to look like somebody who can attract people with big and heavy boobs, go ahead and meander onto my merch store, otakusanonymous.net, where you can pick up some of the greatest anime t-shirts, sweatshirts, and sticker packs known to man. I guess you could also use the clothes to cover your big and heavy boobs, but let's be real, there's a pretty good chance you're a man if you're watching this video. I know my demos, but then again, men can also have big and heavy boobs. It's a stupid intro to a very serious chapter, which we're getting right into. So, chapter 247. If you thought that JJK was taking too long to wrap up all these important fights, then boy oh boy, are you gonna love this chapter. Because while technically Higuruma and Yuji burst onto the stage to battle against Sukuna what feels like about 10 chapters ago, the battle itself hasn't been all that long. See, after Yuji and Higuruma decided to jump into the battle after Kashimo was killed by Sukuna, we immediately cut to Kenjaku, who had to kill the swirly-haired girl and the guy who was able to pull his teeth out and make them explode, and then who ultimately had to battle against Takaba in one of the more confusing, grueling, and unique battles we've ever seen in manga history. And thus it wasn't really until about a chapter ago that this fated battle between Higuruma, Yuji, and Sukuna finally really kicked off. As before the battle even started, we had to do a Gegekatami covering my own ass chapter, where he explained that the Japanese law would still be able to prosecute Sukuna for his crimes of 1,000 years ago, because he was a power scaler before he was a manga artist. I just know it. And thus chapter 247 starts out quick and never slows down. The chapter opens up where chapter 246 left us, Sukuna and Higuruma facing each other in a one-on-one, as Sukuna was able to blast Higuruma away from Yuji, but Higuruma was able to nullify a large amount of the attack using domain amplification. For those of you who don't remember what domain amplification is, genuinely, I can't blame you. Domain amplification, for those of you who don't remember, is kind of like a simple domain. However, that is to say that a domain amplification is an extension of your domain without it being a domain expansion. But since everybody has an innate domain inside their brain, which is kind of like their consciousness, many people have the ability to expand their domain to create something akin to a simple domain to battle against domain expansions. However, a domain expansion and a simple domain aren't the only two ways to expand your domain. See, because if a simple domain is a bubble around you, a domain expansion is more like expanding parts of your domain on specific parts of your body. And when you do these domain expansions or these domain amplifications, you're pushing out a hollow domain around your body. body. And that's inherently the difference between a domain amplification and a domain expansion. See, because by amplifying the domain on your fist using domain amplification, you create a bubble of empty domain around your fist, kind of like Gon's Jaja Ken. And therefore, when you come into contact with somebody else's cursed techniques, those cursed techniques and cursed energy actually floods into the empty domain. And thus, when an empty domain comes into contact with somebody else's cursed technique, it's able to nullify that cursed technique. This is why the disaster curses tried to use domain amplification against Gojo, as the infinity that protected Gojo is a cursed technique. But by nullifying said cursed technique with the domain amplification, they were able to punch through infinity, at least in theory. However, there's a problem with amplifying your domain, and that is once you use domain amplification, you can't use your innate techniques. So let's say hypothetically, Sukuna were to use a domain amplification. If Sukuna is amplifying his domain, he can't use cleave or dismantle, the shrine, or his fire arrow. However, that rule is slightly hazy, and we're learning that at the beginning of chapter 247. See, apparently at the highest level of Jujutsu sorcerers, when you use domain amplification, you're able to pause your techniques, not end them. And we learn this from Sukuna, who's watching Higuruma operate. See, the reason that Sukuna believes that Higuruma has a Gojo-like ceiling is because when Higuruma amplified his domain to make sure that Sukuna's attack didn't kill him, he made sure to make sure that his Executioner Sword, which is a cursed technique, would not disappear. That is to say that technically every single time Higuruma uses domain amplification, the Executioner Sword should disappear. But because Higuruma is a genius on par with Gojo, he's able to keep the Executioner Blade alight through domain amplifications, which really impresses Sukuna so much that he compares Higuruma to himself, as whenever Sukuna uses domain amplification, he makes sure to not stop Maharaga's adaptation, but simply put a pause to it. See, because if Sukuna didn't have an incredibly high level of cursed energy control, whenever he amplified his domain, he would actually be nullifying Maharaga's cursed technique, which would be nullifying Maharaga's adaptation. After Sukuna decides to compliment Higuruma in his head, he decides to start what is objectively kind of a sloppy fight. And I don't mean sloppy on the side of Higuruma or Yuji or even Sukuna. I mean sloppy on the side of Gegekatami. It is really hard to figure out what's going on in this battle 90% of the time. So the battle opens with Sukuna saying, Higuruma, right? Like he hadn't just been like, oh my god, this guy's a genius on level with me. Like, stop trying to play it cool, Sukuna. And then I assume that Sukuna uses dismantle on everything around them because everything around Higuruma and Yuji and Sukuna just kind of becomes rubble. But Higuruma isn't deterred by this, as he immediately starts closing the distance between himself and Sukuna, Executioner Sword in hand. Just as Higuruma is starting to close the distance between himself and Sukuna, two rocks which have been very clearly dismantled, that is to say that they've been cubed, explode near Higuruma's face. Now, I don't know if Sukuna did this to distract Higuruma or blind him temporarily, or this shows that a dismantle was launched at Higuruma's head, but he was able to amplify his domain so it only hit the rocks around his head, because for the life of me, I don't know why Sukuna would either use a cleave or dismantle on rocks near Higuruma's head, but not Higuruma's head. So I'm just going to assume that it's a way to show that Higuruma is using domain amplification to nullify, cleave, and or dismantle, but it's probably cleave because it was used on so many things around them and Sukuna didn't do any chance. However, even though Higuruma's been distracted by the rocks to the face, Yuji takes this opportunity to slide in and try and land a counterattack on Sukuna. But Captain Forearms, well, forearms with forearms. He's got big forearms, but he also has forearms. Catches the punch with one arm and puts another arm on Yuji's abdomen, which he then uses cleave on and effectively makes Yuji a tic-tac-toe board. After which Sukuna says, take a good look in the mirror, brat, you're a bore, and throws the now borderline bisected Yuji away, which is bad, because as Yuji is falling, we can very much see through him. So these cuts weren't shallow cuts. I mean, Yuji has been hit by cleave in the past, and they just gave him little surface level cuts, but these were real cuts, like cut out your guts cuts. So our main character is dead. At least for the moment. Higuruma, after this, possibly trying to get in on the game of tic-tac-toe, decides to once again close the distance between him and Sukuna. And Higuruma begins stabbing at Sukuna with a fury of stabs, all of which Sukuna seems to rather easily dodge. In between all of those furious stabs, Sukuna, with his upper right arm, decides to give Higuruma the right cross of a lifetime. But Higuruma, even though he gets spun 180 degrees by the punch, recovers very quickly and uses the momentum of getting absolutely socked to try and swing the blade one more time at Sukuna. But by the time that Higuruma finishes his 360, Sukuna's no longer there. And he's chanting. Specifically, he's saying, Scale of the Dragon, Recoil, Twin Meteors, Dismantle, which as we see cuts the section of freeway that they were standing on in half. Oh yeah, and it also hits Higuruma. But before we see the damage that it did to Higuruma, we see Sukuna saying, heal yourself. Go on and try. because when we finally get to see Higuruma, he's only got one arm to hold a sword anymore, and the light of the executioner blade is real low. And it's at this point that we start getting the definitely not gonna die dialogue from Higuruma, saying it's laughable, really. No matter how cold I've become, no matter how thorough my resolve, the pain is still clear as day. Which keyed us into the fact that Higuruma went into this battle fully expecting to either die or be severely injured. He's telling us in that moment that while I understood that I was gonna take some big old slashes, ow. But don't worry, Higuruma's not down and out quite yet as he decides to stand up from the one knee that he's on. Then immediately get his other arm cut off. And that was the arm holding the executioner's sword. And while Sukuna is cutting off Higuruma's other arm and slashing his two thighs, he says, "Is that as far as you can go?" Which he follows up by saying, "Next is your head. You'll need reverse curse technique. You know that, right? Otherwise, this is the end of the line for you." Taunting his new plaything into healing itself so it's able to keep playing with Sukuna. After we get Sukuna telling Higuruma to give it his best shot, we see a black panel with text that we can assume is being said by Higuruma, which says, "I think I should play my part to its completion and die in this fight." We then cut back to the now armless Higuruma saying, "My role." And before Sukuna is able to take Higuruma's head, a shot of piercing blood flies in at Sukuna's head, which Sukuna reflects with one hand. Not a great look. And after deflecting that piercing blood, Sukuna says this is that older brother curse wound paintings technique. So stubborn. However, it may not be Chozo who fired that piercing blood. Because while Chozo is one of the people who jumped Sukuna after he was able to break out of Higuruma's domain, because if we'll all remember in chapter 246, Chozo decided to one-up Rin and Naruto and got DP'd. Because one of the first things that Chozo tried to do when Sukuna broke out of Higuruma's domain was shoot him with piercing blood. However, Sukuna decided to swat the piercing blood out of the way and punched two hands through Chozo's chest. And while Chozo is a special grade curse spirit with control over blood, and therefore he should be able to stop his bleeding pretty well, we've never seen Chozo use reverse curse technique. And even if he was able to figure out reverse curse technique and heal himself, the battle between Yuji, Higuruma, and Sukuna is now really far away from where the domain was popped up. On top of this, if Chozo was firing off piercing bloods at Sukuna to try and save Higuruma, one, this would obviously imply that he healed himself with the reverse curse technique, or somebody who's able to apply reverse curse technique to other people got to Chozo before he died. Well, and there's only two people outside of Sukuna on Earth who can apply reverse curse technique to somebody else, and those are Shoko and Yuta, who are far away currently. But it would also beg the question, why is Chozo only firing off these piercing bloods, which he know don't work against Sukuna from a distance? Why wouldn't Chozo try to close the distance and save his little brother and Higuruma? On top of this, we know that this shot comes from a far way away, and Sukuna is only assuming that it's Chozo because as it currently stands, the only person who's ever tried to use piercing blood against Sukuna is Chozo. And that's not to mention the fact that Sukuna purposely dodged the piercing blood from Chozo. However, this piercing blood, which he knew was coming, he chose to block. Now, this can most likely speak to the differences between these two piercing bloods that we've seen in the last two chapters. As in chapter 246, because of the massive pressure that Chozo was able to apply to his piercing blood, Sukuna may have understood that it actually posed somewhat of a threat to him, which would imply why Sukuna decided to take out Chozo first. However, because this piercing blood wasn't fired with nearly the same amount of pressure, he was able to block it, and with only one hand. And therefore, it seems more likely to me than not that this isn't Chozo firing off this piercing blood. And it's also definitely not Noritoshi Kamo. As we learned in the lead-up meetings to this battle against Sukuna, that Noritoshi Kamo, the student from the Kyoto school, decided to leave and spend time with his family, and thus is not present in Shinjuku to battle against Sukuna. And thus, when it comes down to it, the only two people who are confirmed to be able to use piercing blood are Chozo and Noritoshi Kamo, one of which is disposed of and the other of which is just not there, which leaves us with a third possible option that I theorized a couple of weeks ago. And that third possible option is Yuji. See, because we learned in the Japanese law chapter that happened a couple of weeks ago that for some reason Yuji is training with both Noritoshi Kamo and Chozo, as he thanked Noritoshi for training him because Chozo was such a bad teacher. And this is interesting because there's only one thing that these two have in common, and that's the ability to control blood. And when we consider the fact that Kenjaku is Yuji's mother, and when you consider the fact that by the time that Kenjaku became Yuji's mother, he had already been Noritoshi Kamo, and Kenjaku's brain swapping ability allows him to hold on to the curse techniques of his previous lives, no reason for us to assume, especially when you consider the fact that Yuji is also a death wound painting like Chozo, who are all created by the original Noritoshi Kamo, that Yuji should have blood manipulation, and that the red arms he's currently using in the battle against Sukuna are Yuji using flowing red stack, the blood hardening ability that Chozo used to defeat Yuji in the Shibuya incident. And it would make sense that Yuji would want to use that technique because Chozo, who was not a hand-to-hand fighter, was able to defeat Yuji in a hand-to-hand fight using blood manipulation, more specifically, flowing red stack. But in the time that it takes Sukuna to block the piercing blood and be like, oh, that was annoying, Higuruma figures out reverse curse technique and regrows a whole arm. Yeah, they really weren't lying when they said that his ceiling was Gojo. And he uses this new arm as grounds for a surprise attack and stabs Sukuna with the executioner blade through the hand. And just like that, Sukuna is dead. I mean, the Executioner Blade has a one-hit kill clause. Even if you're scratched by it, you die. So getting stabbed in the hand is a for sure death sentence. That is, if the hand's still attached to your body. Because right before Higuruma was able to stab Sukuna through one of his 4 hands, Sukuna cut his own hand off, which inevitably led to Higuruma holding the Executioner Blade with Sukuna's hand on it, kind of like a marshmallow over a fire, with his back turned to Sukuna, who's about a foot away, and he's still got 3 very capable hands. Really, not where you want to be. But don't worry, there's a flashback. So he's safe for a second, and in this flashback, Higuruma is talking to the now leader of the Jujutsu Sorcerer Society, Kusakabe. Not actually the leader, but he appears to be that way, honestly. And Kusakabe is saying, curses getting stronger post-mortem. I guess it's not impossible. And Higuruma responds by saying, if anything, I'd say that would match our general understanding of how curses work. So apparently cursed energy is 100% copied from Nen. If you reveal your technique gets stronger. If you take risk, your technique gets stronger. There's binding vows, and your cursed techniques get stronger after your death. Cursed energy is Nen. I've been saying it for a long time, and now it's confirmed. It's not a bad thing. I love how Nen works. I wish all universes had Nen/cursed energy, but you can't say that that is not directly copied from Nen. The next panel after Higuruma says that, oh yeah, this confirms everything that we know about curses, he once again says my role, and he throws the Executioner Sword up into the sky. At least that's kind of what it looks like. To me, it looks like a roughly drawn cross, but here we are. Maybe that's why I'm reading this chapter 9 days early. I got a version I shouldn't have. And the next panel is Yuji appearing behind Sukuna while reaching out for something, and Higuruma just getting so cleaved. Like more cleaved than Yuji got. And the panel following that is Yuji making eye contact with Higuruma, who appears to be reaching his hand out to Yuji. The next image is a blurry image of Nanami's final words to Yuji: "You've got it from here," implying that Higuruma is putting Yuji in a similar situation as Nanami put him in the Shibuya incident. That is to say, that this is Higuruma dying. Not quite as sad as Nanami's death, but still sad. He's a complex and interesting character with an incredible power ceiling. His backstory is a public defendant who falls out of love with the criminal system because he believes it's corrupt and puts innocent people in jail more often than not, is incredibly on the nose and a very important talking point. And the growth that he and Yuji were able to do together through their fights and through the time they spent together is really cool to watch. But he's not Nanami. And to this point that we're served to Higuruma's presumed final words, "I've done what I can. I am a Jujutsu sorcerer," which I believe is to serve as the moment of us watching a man disenfranchised with his profession truly become the thing that he always wanted to be, a person who helped other people. It's a really cool and really touching moment that closes with Yuji snagging the Executioner Sword out of the air and possibly jamming it into Sukuna's back. Now, the reason I say possibly jamming it into Sukuna's back is because we do see Yuji with the Executioner's Sword, and he is behind Sukuna, and it looks like he's gonna stab it into Sukuna's back. And thus it appears as though the next chapter is finally gonna be the chapter that Yuji exacts his revenge on Sukuna. Except for the fact that it probably won't be, because Gege is a menace to society, and the last time we thought Sukuna was gonna die, Gojo got cut in half. This is an incredible ending to an incredible chapter. And while I do think it would be incredible to see the next chapter opening up with Sukuna holding the Executioner Blade, which is now pierced through his abdomen, I just don't see it happening. I've lost all faith. I genuinely think Sukuna is going to win. I don't actually think that, but I think that more than I should. But this chapter leaves us with a couple of lingering questions that go beyond, is Yuji gonna stab Sukuna? It leaves us with questions that we've already answered, like who fired the piercing blood, but also leaves us with questions like, how is Yuji moving right now? Because as we see in the final panel of this chapter, Yuji still has a hole in him, as the part of Yuji that was cleaved by Sukuna is white as opposed to black like the rest of his uniform, which means that Yuji is still missing about half of his abdomen. And while we've seen Yuji take some incredible damage and get up and keep walking, losing half of his abdomen doesn't really seem like something he would walk away from, especially when you consider the fact that Sukuna, the forefront of knowledge when it comes to killing people, believed that Yuji was probably done, especially when you consider the fact that Sukuna is well known for using exactly as much cursed energy as necessary to kill somebody or something. And thus Sukuna, who got a free shot on Yuji, used as much cursed energy on Yuji as he believed would be enough to kill Yuji. And yet, Yuji is still very much running around, and therefore there are really only two ways in which Yuji could possibly be running around. And that is either, like Higuruma, he also figured out reverse curse technique, which I find unlikely. And the second possibility is that Yuji is able to run around, but he's not healed. And the reason he's able to do that is because he was able to stop the blood from leaving him using his blood manipulation, which further backs up our theory that we made a couple of weeks ago that Yuji has the Kamo curse technique. Because while a hole in your abdomen isn't super great, it shouldn't kill you, at least not immediately. And the way you die from a hole in your abdomen is bleeding out. But if you can control your blood from leaving your body, then you should be fine, at least for a little bit, at least long enough to stab the 19-finger version of the cursed spirit that lived inside of you for about a year. And when you consider the fact that a piercing blade was shot at Sukuna, even though Chozo is way worse off than Yuji is currently, for assuming that the person firing off that piercing blood was Yuji, why wouldn't he be able to stop his own bleeding? On top of this, the final question that we're left with is, will the Executioner's sword kill Megami? Because if we are assuming that the next chapter is going to open with Sukuna's death, then it's fair to ask the question, will Megami die alongside Sukuna? And the answer for that is hopefully not. See, the reason that I'm bringing this up is because we do kind of have an answer as to whether or not Megami will die if Sukuna is stabbed with the Executioner's sword. But it was talked about very shortly a couple of chapters ago, so a lot of you might have missed it or forgot. See, it was revealed by Higuruma that the Executioner's sword works by killing the person who confiscation and death penalty are cast upon. And since it's already been shown that Judge Man has the ability to differentiate between a cursed spirit and the body that they're inhabiting, Higuruma believes that the Executioner's sword will kill Sukuna, who's guilty of the crimes, but not Megami, who isn't. This goes double for the fact when you consider the fact that Higuruma just died and that his curse should get stronger post-death, thus the Executioner blade should get stronger in the hands of Yuji. Now, I don't necessarily know what stronger is going to look like for a sword that already has a one-hit kill mechanic, but I'm assuming it's gonna get bigger. But as it currently stands in the hands of Yuji in the final panel of this chapter, it looks like a dagger. So maybe curses don't get stronger after death, and Kusakabe and Higuruma were just simply wrong. But I don't think that's what's gonna happen. That would be weird. So more likely than not, I believe in the next chapter, Sukuna is going to be able to dodge this initial stab by Yuji, but because of the amplified power of the Executioner blade, now, after Higuruma's death, Yuji is eventually going to be able to overcome Sukuna, leading to Sukuna's death at Yuji's hands. But there is one problem. While Yuji should be able to staunch the bleeding of his Rin hole, that's not going to keep him alive forever. And thus either Yuji's going to have to try and finish the fight as fast as possible, or somebody's going to have to come to the battlefield to heal Yuji. Either way, we won't know for another 18-ish days, 14 days for leaks. Unless the 2-week break was a complete and total lie and we're gonna get a new chapter in 7 days. Who knows? Life is on fire. But all I know is that an additional chapter of JJK 10 days before I anticipated it coming out is the greatest Christmas miracle I could ever ask for. Though ironically, it came from the real-life version of the Grinch. But I hope you ho-ho-hos are having a fantastic holiday season and enjoying this extra JJK content. And if you are, tell me in the comments below. And while you're down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. I regret opening this video talking about big and hefty boobs.